The second season of Star Trek Strange New Worlds is set to premiere in a couple of months, which is great news for Trekkies because the first season of Strange New Worlds was greeted last year with almost universal acclaim. I say almost because you can't please everybody, but it is sometimes possible to please most people, as Season 1 of Strange New Worlds demonstrated with its winning combination of outstanding production design, typical for this generation of Trek shows, and strong writing that balances mostly self-contained single-episode stories with larger character and story arcs that unfold throughout the season. Not typical for this generation of Trek shows, all brought to life by a cast filled with charming, likable actors. The show simultaneously embodies all the best parts of the newer Trek shows and feels like a welcome throwback to previous eras of the franchise. I myself declared it a perfect first season. 10 episodes, some definitely better than others, but not a bad one in the bunch. For me, one of the best episodes of Season 1 was Episode 6, Lift Us Where Suffering Cannot Reach. This was also one of the most talked about episodes of the season because lots of viewers, those who liked it and those who didn't, noticed something familiar about it. So familiar, in fact, that some of them were compelled to ask, did Star Trek actually rip off Ursula K. Le Guin? A thumbnail sketch of Ursula K. Le Guin for those of you who need it. She was one of the most popular and revered science fiction and fantasy authors of the latter half of the 20th century. Published 21 novels, over 100 short stories, plus children's books, poetry, essays, works of literary criticism. She was prolific and beloved. The books in her Earthsea series and Hainish cycle remain widely read to this day. So, that's who Ursula Le Guin is. Or was, actually. She passed away in 2018. I must confess, I'm not at all well-read on her work. I read her novel, The Dispossessed, 2 years ago for the Readaway livestream series I did alongside my friend and Trek Reluctantly co-host Dana Cole. And I've read, I think, 2 of her short stories, but that's it. Nonetheless, I've learned enough about her over the years to know that her work frequently uses sci-fi and fantasy to examine political issues and offer critiques and commentary on real-world social problems. Sounds like a good fit for Star Trek, huh? That's apparently what Strange New Worlds writers Robin Wasserman and Bill Wolkoff thought when they were writing Lift Us Where Suffering Cannot Reach. You may have seen the video I published a few months ago about Captain Pike, the lead protagonist of Strange New Worlds, where I spend some time looking at this episode through the lens of what it shows us about Pike as a character. Now, I'm going to examine the episode more broadly, starting with my trademark, purposefully half-assed, yuck-filled plot summary. I'll try not to make any of the same jokes as I made last time, but if a repeat does slip in there somewhere, remember, I'm openly admitting that I'm doing kind of the same thing I just did like 3 videos ago, which means none of you are allowed to criticize me for it. The Enterprise has come to the Magellan system to conduct what Pike describes in his captain's log as a routine cartographic survey. He also casually mentions that he was here 10 years ago and was nearly killed by a pulsar while on a rescue mission, adding that he expects this visit to the system will be a lot quieter, thus guaranteeing that he will have an experience so soul-crushingly horrific that it will haunt his nightmares for the rest of his life. I expect our mission today will be a lot quieter? Shouldn't this guy know by now not to tempt fate like that? You already bought yourself an extended ride in a beep chair, Chris. How much worse do you want to make it? Anyway, Pike shares a turbolift ride with Uhura on their way to the bridge. Uhura's training rotation has placed her in security this week, where she's been working with Lieutenant Noonien Singh, who has been teaching Uhura some of the lessons of security. Lesson 1. Be nice. I'm just kidding. That is definitely not Lesson 1. Or probably a thought that even occurs till on, like, ever. Pike warns Uhura to watch out for Lesson 7, and they arrive at the bridge just in time to receive a distress call. A non-Federation shuttlecraft is under attack. Pike hails the attacking ship and orders it to stand down, but the attacking ship opens fire on the Enterprise, and Pike's like, "Oh no, are you serious, bro? I could destroy you!" But he asks La'an to disable the ship without destroying it, because that's what a nice guy he is. La'an instructs Uhura to target the ship's weapon systems with low-power phasers, but the ship changes direction right after Uhura fires, damaging the ship much more seriously than intended and sending it crashing to the surface of a nearby moon. The shuttle that was being attacked is also in bad shape, so Pike orders the occupants beamed aboard, and he and Number 1 head to the transporter room to receive them. 3 people beam over from the damaged shuttle: a man, a young boy, and a woman Pike recognizes immediately as Allura. She recognizes him too. She sees him and she's like, "Lieutenant Pike?" And Pike's like, "Wow, hi, you look great. It's so cool you remember me. I mean, I'm actually a captain now. Not that I'm bragging. I'm not. It's not a big deal. I don't even care. But yeah, good to see you." The other 2 people who beamed aboard are Gamal, he's the other grown-up, and the first servant, he's the kid. When Pike asks Gamal if he's the boy's father, Gamal says, "Only in the biological sense." "Oh, it's like that, is it?" "Well, just remember, Gamal, any man can be a father, but it takes a real man to be a dad." So I'm told. I don't have kids. While Dr. Mbenga checks out Gamal and the first servant in sickbay, Allura fills in Pike and the others in the briefing room. Allura suspects the attack on their shuttle was part of an attempted kidnapping. The first servant is a holy figure, and he's only a couple of days away from his ascension ceremony, which is kind of a big deal. So, if he were to be abducted, the people of Majalis would pay any price to get him back. As far as who would want to do this, Allura mentions a nearby alien colony, but their 2 worlds have coexisted in peace for centuries, so why would anyone from there want to kidnap the first servant? Since the ship that attacked Allura's shuttle also attacked the Enterprise, Pike is required by Starfleet regulations to conduct an investigation. So La'an leads an away team to the surface of the moon to check out the crash site of that attacking ship. Allura insists on going along, and after looking around for a bit, she finds something: an oath coin, the kind given to members of the Magellan military who have sworn to safeguard the life of the first servant. It's starting to look like this attempted abduction was an inside job. Meanwhile, in sickbay, Dr. Mbenga and Nurse Chapel are tending to the first servant when Gamal steps in like, "Get your hands off him, you butchers!" No offense, but our medical science is so advanced compared to yours, you might as well be trying to treat his head trauma by drilling a hole in his skull. Gamal explains that he's a doctor, though since his son was chosen to be the first servant, his practice focuses exclusively on that one patient. He talks about how Magellan medical science uses principles of quantum mechanics to heal injuries at the subatomic level. Mbenga, who has a terminally ill daughter he's hiding in the pattern buffer of sickbay's medical transporter, is intrigued when Gamal declares there is no disease on Majalis. "We have an old saying," Gamal tells Mbenga, "let the tree that grows from the roots of sacrifice lift us where suffering cannot reach." Mbenga's like, "What a poetic and not at all ominous old saying that is." Pike goes with Allura to the capital of Majalis, a floating city. Majalis, you see, is kind of a utopia. No illness, no internal strife, a city in the sky, seems kind of perfect. The kind of place where you could sit down, take off one shoe, drop it on the floor, and do the same with the other one right away. They have the guards line up, and Allura inspects their oath coins. She notices something fishy about one guy's coin, and the dude just has no poker face at all. He kills one of his fellow guards and makes a run for it. The rest of the guards chase him along with Pike and Allura, and they all catch up to him in the garden. Allura asks him what he was doing on the ship that attacked her shuttle, and he's like, "I was fulfilling my oath. Long live the first servant!" And he grabs Allura and holds a knife on her. But Allura fights him off, throws him to the ground, and stabs him to death with his own knife. Yeah! That's what you get! Guy whose full motives have not yet been revealed. Back on the Enterprise, La'an tells Uhura to get to work translating some data chips she kinda sorta illegally took from the crashed ship, hoping the chips contain answers about who Alora and the First Servant's attackers were and what they wanted. In sickbay, the First Servant has already fully recovered from the injuries he sustained in the attack thanks to that incredible Magellan technology. Mbenga says to Gamal, so hey, hypothetically speaking, if you had a patient who was, an 11-year-old girl suffering from a rapidly progressing terminal illness, could your quantum medical doohickeys cure her? Gamal's like, sure. And Mbenga's like, neat. So if I had such a patient, hypothetically, okay, dude, I'm not saying I do, I could send her to you on Majalis and you could fix her up? But Gamal says, no, actually, our laws prevent us from sharing our technology with outsiders. Oh my god, what am I going to do now? I curse who or whatever created this unjust universe. My baby girl, my sweet baby girl. However will I save you now? What? Hypothetically. Back down on Majalis, Pike and Alora have at last succumbed to their mutual and long-simmering passion for one another, which, obviously, if you're into someone like that and they're into you the same way, and you see them get attacked and then turn the tables and kill their attacker, you're having sex that night. It's gonna happen, and it's gonna be amazing. Watching someone you're attracted to take a life in self-defense is the biggest turn on ever. I imagine. Pike and Allura are in bed following the act, and Pike lapses into his typical pillow talk routine where he informs his lover that he has a bleak and inalterable destiny that will see him grievously injured, scarred, and using a beep chair sometime in the next 10 years or so, and there won't be anything Federation medical science can do to help him. Allura says, oh, our quantum whatchamacallits could fix that for you, no problem. Only thing is, we don't share our technology with outsiders, so you'd have to come live here permanently. But, I mean, it's better than a beep chair, am I right? It's something to consider. And Pike does appear to consider it. I mean, Allura seems cool. They like each other. And Majalis is paradise. What possible reason could anyone have for not wanting to live there? Later, back aboard the Enterprise, Uhura has finished her analysis of those data chips La'an swiped from the crashed ship. She confirms that the would-be kidnappers of the First Servant came from Prospect 7, that nearby colony Allura mentioned before. But Uhura also found out something Allura didn't mention. After studying their language, Uhura has concluded that the people of Prospect 7 are not aliens, as Allura said, but have roots on Majalis. Prospect 7 is described as a world with a pretty inhospitable environment. La'an wonders why anyone would want to leave Majalis to go live there. Spock has another question. Why didn't either Allura or Gamal tell them the nearby colony was of Magellan origin? Before they can get too deep into those questions, Dr. Mbenga calls to tell Pike that Gamal and the First Servant are trying to leave the ship. Pike goes to the transporter room and tells Gamal he thinks they'll be safer on the Enterprise until they know more about who was trying to hurt the First Servant, but Gamal's not having it. Then, suddenly, both Gamal and the First Servant are beamed away by another ship that has just been detected nearby. Gamal is beamed back a moment later without the First Servant. Spock detects the First Servant on the other ship, but they can't beam him back because the other ship's shields are up. Pike orders the other ship to be held in a tractor beam. The other ship attempts to escape while still in the grip of the tractor beam and is destroyed, apparently killing the First Servant along with everyone else aboard. Allura ain't happy about that. Pike gives her the bad news and she's like, that's it! We're done! Our beautiful world is about to crumble to dust before my very eyes. If the First Servant isn't able to complete his ascension, it will be the end of everything! It's over, man! It's all over! Damn, I know it's bad news, but you act like the sky is falling. Not the sky! Us! Out of the sky! As in, our floating city will literally fall from the sky and crash into the planet if the First Servant doesn't ascend. Oh my god, why am I even talking about this with you? And she hangs up. Pike turns to the others and says, I can't help but feel like this is partly our fault. how did that other ship manage to beam the first servant off of the Enterprise anyway? Uhura has an idea about that and casts an accusatory gaze toward Gamal. Apparently, one surefire way to beam someone off the ship without anyone on the Enterprise knowing about it until it happened is to specifically target their biopatterns. Before they left sickbay to head to the transporter room, Gamal accessed the biopatterns on file for both himself and the first servant. Pike is about to try and get the full story out of Gamal when Spock pages him to Deck 17 for yet another shocking development. Pike goes to meet Spock and has La'an take Gamal to the brig. On Deck 17, Spock catches Pike up on a few things. He recalls a talk he had with the first servant in sickbay during a scene I left out of my summary because, Jesus, isn't this going on long enough as it is? Anyway, the first servant, precocious little genius he is, told Spock about how he was thinking about reconfiguring his biobed in order to generate a subspace signal on a particular frequency. Out of curiosity, Spock began monitoring that frequency, and sometime after the ship that beamed away the first servant exploded, Spock received a distress call on that frequency. The signal was originating from right here on the Enterprise. Spock tracks the signal to its source, and he and Pike find the first servant, very much alive, inside a cargo container, where apparently he was beamed after being abducted from the transporter room. Now that he's free, the first servant insists on being returned to Majalis so that he can complete his ascension ceremony. Pike goes with him. Meanwhile, Number 1 speaks with Gamal in the brig. Gamal admits that he was part of the plot to abduct the first servant, insisting that he was trying to save his son. Save him from what? Number 1 asks. Meanwhile, in the floating city of Majalis, Pike and Allura are attending the ascension ceremony. Pike is like, so how does the first servant keep the city in the sky? Allura's like, oh, it's complicated. You know, we choose a first servant, he goes through the ascension ceremony, yada yada yada, floating city. What about Gamal trying to kidnap his own son? Why would he do that? And how come you didn't tell us Prospect 7 was a Magellan colony? Did you come here to watch the ascension of the first servant or to make me uncomfortable by asking seemingly simple questions? Back on the Enterprise, Number 1 has been given the whole story of what's going on by Gamal, and she would really like to talk to Captain Pike about it. Unfortunately, Majalis is currently blocking all outside communications and preventing anyone from being transported to or from the planet. Pike accompanies Allura, the first servant, and the guards into the sacred chamber where the ascension will be completed. There's a throne and a massive generator. Suddenly, the first servant, who has been all about ascending up to this point, is becoming nervous. Allura asks him if he is ready to give himself to the people of Majalis, if he freely chooses his fate. Before he can answer, a couple of the guards are like, excuse us, coming through, and pass by carrying something away from the throne on a stretcher. Pike peeks and sees to his horror that the thing on the stretcher is the shriveled, depleted body of a child. Suddenly realizing what's about to happen, Pike tries to fight his way past the guards to the first servant, but he's stopped and knocked unconscious. The first servant, obviously terrified, is placed on the throne where an array of cables attach themselves to his head. Pike regains consciousness and finds himself at Allura's place. He immediately goes to leave, declaring his intention to disconnect the first servant from that machine in the sacred chamber. But Allura tells him he's wasting his time. Now that the ascension is complete, unplugging the first servant from the machine would only kill him. Pike asks why plugging a child into it is necessary to keep the machine running, and Allura is like, our ancestors set it up that way. We don't know why it works. We just know that it works. Like homeopathy. Only it works. Pike asks, will he suffer? And Allura's like, well, yeah, but we openly admit that, which means you can't criticize us for it. Pike's like, I can't believe you yada-yada'd your whole civilization running on the suffering of children. Excuse you, child, Allura says. On Majalis, the first servant is the only person who suffers. Because of the suffering of this one child, everyone else can live in health and abundance. Allura's like, can you honestly say the abundance of your federation isn't at the expense of far more suffering people? That argument doesn't work on Pike. He says, this shit is sick, and I'm reporting it to Starfleet. Alora's like, go ahead, we're not a Federation planet. What's Starfleet gonna do? Nothing? Thought so. As for how sick we supposedly are, maybe you just need to think about it. Perhaps in the future you won't feel the same way. Pike calls the Enterprise and beams away. And it doesn't seem like he's coming back. In sickbay, Gamal visits with Dr. Mbenga. Gamal has requested a ride to the colony on Prospect 7, but in the meantime, he offers his help with Mbenga's hypothetical patient. I failed to save my child, Gamal tells Mbenga. I don't want to fail the next one. Gamal says without his Magellan equipment, he doesn't have a cure, but hopefully he can help Mbenga get started on finding one eventually. And we finish on Pike, alone in his quarters, nursing a drink, staring out the window, perhaps pondering the troubling fact that there are worse fates than the one that waits for him. The end! Oh, wow, fun episode, huh? What's it got to do with Ursula Le Guin? I'll tell you. In 1973, the sci-fi anthology New Dimensions 3 included a new short story by Le Guin titled The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. It would go on to win the Hugo Award for Best Short Story and has become one of Le Guin's signature works and one of the most honored and influential science fiction stories of the last half-century. The story describes the day of the Festival of Summer in Omelas, a beautiful, prosperous city by the sea, half-ringed by mountains to the north and the west, populated by happy people who have created for themselves a peaceful, egalitarian society. The air is filled with the sounds of ringing bells and music and singing and the smells of food. The citizens of Omelas govern themselves. They have no kings, no armed forces, no slaves. They have religion, but no priests. They live lives of joy and comfort. The narrator describes it this way. A boundless and generous contentment, a magnanimous triumph, felt not against some outer enemy, but in communion with the finest and fairest in the souls of all men everywhere, and the splendor of the world's summer. This is what swells the hearts of the people of Omelas, and the victory they celebrate is that of life. Seems pretty great, right? Magnificent city, ideal society, healthy and contented people. I bet if you lived there, you'd be healthy and contented too. Probably. Because there is this other thing about Omelas. In a basement under one of the beautiful public buildings of Omelas, or perhaps in the cellar of one of its spacious private homes, there is a room. It has one locked door and no window. The floor is dirt, a little damp to the touch, as cellar dirt usually is. The room is about 3 paces long and 2 wide, a mere broom closet or disused tool room. In the room, a child is sitting. It could be a boy or a girl. It looks about 6, but is actually nearly 10. The door is always locked, and nobody ever comes, except that sometimes the child has no understanding of time or interval. Sometimes the door rattles terribly and opens, and a person or several people are there. The food bowl and the water jug are hastily filled. The door is locked. The people at the door never say anything, but the child, who has not always lived in the tool room and can remember sunlight and its mother's voice, sometimes speaks. I will be good, it says. Please let me out. I will be good. They never answer. All the people of Omelas know the child is there. Some of them come to see the child, though visitors are forbidden from helping or even saying a kind word to the child. The people of Omelas all know the child is there, and they all know that the joy and prosperity of their city depends on the misery of that one child. And if that child were ever to be freed and cleaned up and fed and loved and allowed to experience their own happiness, it would mean the end of everyone else's. These are the terms the narrator tells us. There's one more thing to know about Omelas, though. The majority of those who come to see the wretched child are themselves children or adolescents. They are frequently very upset by what they see, saddened, horrified, enraged at the injustice of their comfort being purchased by that poor child's suffering. For most of them, as time goes on, these feelings fade. They rationalize the necessity of the suffering child. They justify it. They come to realize that the prosperity of the many is worth the deprivation of that one, though they do continue to feel sorry for the poor, poor child. But, the narrator goes on, at times, one of the adolescent girls or boys who go see the child does not go home to weep or rage, does not, in fact, go home at all. Sometimes also a man or a woman much older falls silent for a day or two, then leaves home. These people go out into the street and walk down the street alone. They keep walking and walk straight out of the city of Omelas, through the beautiful gates. They keep walking across the farmlands of Omelas. They go on. They leave Omelas. They walk ahead into the darkness, and they do not come back. The place they go towards is a place even less imaginable to most of us than the City of Happiness. I cannot describe it at all. It is possible that it does not exist, but they seem to know where they are going, the ones who walk away from Omelas. It's a brilliant story, and if you've never read it, I highly recommend it. And yeah, as you can probably tell, there are some similarities between the ones who walk away from Omelas and lift us where suffering cannot reach. Let's run down the checklist. Beautiful city, check. Utopian society, check. Thousands of happy peppy people, check. Great big public celebration, check. The existence of all those wonderful things dependent on the suffering of a single child, check. A certain number of people from this society who are not okay with this arrangement and leave, check. Quite a few points in common there between these two stories. And it's a good bet these commonalities are not coincidental. Current Grand Poobah of the Trek franchise and co-creator and executive producer of Star Trek Strange New Worlds, Alex Kurtzman, cited the ones who walk away from Omelas as an inspiration for the storyline of Season 3 of Star Trek Discovery, so we know he's familiar with it. Plus, lots of viewers picked up on the similarities between the Strange New Worlds episode and Le Guin's short story right away. In his extremely positive review of the episode for the excellent website trekmovie.com, Anthony Pascal describes Lift Us Where Suffering Cannot Reach as, quote, almost a beat-for-beat recreation of the ones who walk away from Omelas. So, that answers the question, right? Did Star Trek actually rip off Ursula Le Guin? Yes. And follow me on this, no. It's undeniable that the Star Trek episode has a lot in common with the Le Guin story, and unreasonable to assume those similarities aren't intentional. I haven't found any statements from Kurtzman or other producers of the show or the writers of this episode, Robin Wasserman and Bill Wolkoff, where they say, yeah, this episode was inspired by the ones who walk away from Omelas, but come on. However, I don't think it's as simple as, yes, they ripped off Le Guin. For one thing, it's not only the similarities that matter here, it's the differences. There are a lot of them, and there would almost have to be. You probably noticed my summary of the Le Guin story was a lot shorter than my summary of the Strange New Worlds episode. That's because the Strange New Worlds episode is almost an hour long, while the Le Guin story clocks in at around 7 pages in its original printing. Adapting a 7-page short story into an hour-long TV show without introducing any changes would be a challenge, maybe even impossible, unless you could somehow find a way to power your writing process from the suffering of a single abject child. Those of you who have both seen the episode and read the short story know that there are significant dissimilarities between the two in terms of plot, starting with the fact that the Strange New Worlds episode has one. Le Guin's short story is more of a tableau than a linear narrative. It describes Omelas, describes the festival, describes the child and the circumstances of their imprisonment, and how the people of Omelas feel about that, and what some of them choose to do in response to it, but it doesn't have a plot to speak of. Nothing really happens. That's not a knock against the story. Le Guin's purpose isn't to involve us in an event-driven narrative, but rather to lay out a scenario and hopefully get us to think about it, to ask ourselves what we would do if we lived in Omelas. Would we stay with those who live there and benefit from the suffering of the child? Would we walk away? Would we choose some other option? The writing is vivid, the themes are challenging, the plot, or lack thereof, isn't the point. But episodes of sci-fi action-adventure series need plots, so the writers of Lift Us Where Suffering Cannot Reach provide one by making their version of the ones who walk away a more active presence. Instead of merely leaving Majalis, some of those who relocated to the Prospect 7 colony decide that the suffering of the child, the first servant, is intolerable and must be stopped, even if it means the destruction of the magnificent floating city. So they, along with allies on Majalis like Gamal and the guard who Allura slays in sexy self-defense, hatch their scheme to abduct the first servant and take him away to safety. None of that is in the short story. Nor is any of the Star Trek shit, obviously. Captain Pike's ill-fated romance with Allura, the parallels between Pike and the first servant, the way Dr. Mbenga's efforts to cure his terminally ill daughter tie in with the advanced technology of Majalis, the investigation into the attempted abduction that is carried out by La'an and Uhura, Spock being present. That's a dead giveaway you're watching Star Trek. If Spock's there, not you. You're cool, though. I got no beef with Dr. Spock. Rather than thinking of it as a ripoff, I prefer to characterize Lift Us Where Suffering Cannot Reach as a translation of the ones who walk away from Omelas into the milieu of Star Trek. It's not an adaptation or an imitation so much as an answer to the question, what would happen if the Enterprise visited Omelas? More fundamentally, I don't think ripoff is a remotely fair term to apply to Lift Us Where Suffering Cannot Reach because it has a pejorative quality that implies both laziness and deception on the part of the creators. Were the writers of this Strange New Worlds episode being lazy? Did they just not feel like writing their own story, so they cribbed from Ursula Le Guin and then added a whole bunch of their own stuff? That doesn't work. And deception? The short story is so well known, and the parallels between the short story and the episode are so clear that I can't imagine the writers were trying to sneak them past anyone. Just because two works bear similarities to one another, that doesn't mean one is ripped off from the other, even if those similarities are obvious and intentional. There is such a thing as one work riffing on one another. There is such a thing as homage. Was George Lucas ripping off Akira Kurosawa when he incorporated many elements inspired by the Hidden Fortress into Star Wars? Was Brian De Palma ripping off Sergei Eisenstein when he based the train station shootout in The Untouchables on the Odessa Steppe sequence from Battleship Potemkin? Was Disturbia ripping off Rear Window? Actually, that last one did wind up in court, though technically the dispute didn't involve Rear Window, but the short story upon which Rear Window was based. The trust that owns the rights to Cornell Woolrich's 1942 short story, It Had to Be Murder, sued the producers of the 2007 Shia LaBeouf vehicle, Disturbia, claiming its plot was lifted from Woolrich's story without permission. The court found in favor of Disturbia, ruling that while there were similarities between the short story and the movie, they did not outweigh the differences, including the facts that the movie had a more dynamic setting and mood than the short story and contained multiple subplots, while the short story had none. Somebody, maybe Pablo Picasso, maybe William Faulkner, maybe T.S. Eliot, who knows, at some point said, good artists copy, but great artists steal. That's a hilariously blunt way of putting it, but the underlying idea of that saying is true. Artists, writers, creative people down through history to the present day have always been inspired by one another, borrowed from one another, responded to one another, composed variations, paid tribute, referenced, and, sure, ripped each other off now and again. Sometimes inspiration and homage cross the line into outright plagiarism, but the bar for that, legally and morally, is pretty high. It would be difficult to compellingly argue, I think, that the elements which lift us where suffering cannot reach shares in common with the ones who walk away from Omelas ought to be treated as the intellectual property of Ursula Le Guin. The themes, and indeed even the basic premise Le Guin is working with in the ones who walk away from Omelas, don't originate with her. When speaking or writing about the story, she credited both Dostoevsky and William James with giving her the idea. The influence of James is particularly direct, so much so that Le Guin subtitled the story Variations on a Theme by William James. In his 1891 essay, The Moral Philosopher and the Moral Life, James writes, "If the hypothesis were offered us of a world in which millions should be kept permanently happy on the one simple condition that a certain lost soul on the far-off edge of things should lead a life of lonely torture, even though an impulse arose within us to clutch at the happiness so offered, how hideous a thing would be its enjoyment when deliberately accepted as the fruit of such a bargain." Ripping off William James, Le Guin? Miss Big Shot, Hugo Award winner, writing stories based on concepts she lifted straight from one of the most influential philosophers in American history, trying to take credit for the hard work of another writer. Well, there's no place for that sort of thing in Star Trek. Right, Gene? Not you. There. Hey folks, hope you enjoyed this one. I'm gonna let you know what the subject of the next Trek Actually video is gonna be, but before I do that, I want to give shout outs to some of my newest Patreon patrons and channel members. First, the new patrons. They are Lisa and Doug. Thanks, Lisa and Doug. Carly Rich. Thanks, Carly. Nell the Exile. Thanks, Nell. Nick Neither Nor. Thanks, Nick Neither Nor. George Stevens. Thanks, George. Joshua Frankel, thanks Joshua. Booyah696969, thanks Booyah696969. Stephen Crane, thanks Stephen. Mike Hunt, thanks Mike. Cindy Long, thanks Cindy. Haley Alderman, thanks Haley. Jeff Snyder, thanks Jeff. W. Stephen Carroll, thanks W. Stephen. Next, new channel members, or should I say new member, since there's only one this month. They are David Bourne. Thanks, David. If you want to support this channel, you can do so by going to patreon.com/Steve Shives or clicking the join button to become a member of this channel. All patrons and members get access to exclusive posts that allow you to vote in the polls that determine upcoming Trek Actually topics, and also submit questions ahead of time for my twice-monthly Ask Away live streams. If you pledge $5 a month or more on Patreon, or become a member at the $5 a month tier or higher, you get a shout out at the end of a Trek Actually video. If you'd rather give a one-time gift than a recurring monthly contribution, you're always more than welcome to do that by clicking the thanks button right below the video, or via PayPal or Venmo. The links for those are in the video description. Many thanks. If you like what I do on YouTube, especially the Star Trek related stuff, you should also check out my side projects, The Ensign's Log, the Star Trek themed comedy podcast that I'm on alongside Jason Harding and Dana Cole, and Trek Reluctantly, the watch-along stream Dana and I do every Wednesday starting at 6 p.m. Eastern on this channel right here. As always, links in the description. Now, to next month's Regulation Trek Actually topic. I had a feeling about this one. In February, the topic was who is actually Captain Picard's greatest nemesis, and that one went over pretty well. So I included a similar topic as an option in the poll for next month's topic, and to my non-surprise, it won pretty emphatically, with 61% of the final vote, a landslide. The topic of next month's Trek Actually video, as chosen by my patrons and channel members, is who is actually Captain Sisko's greatest nemesis? Should be fun. Can't wait for that one. That's next month. I'll be back then and a bunch of times before then, so Until the next time I see you, whenever that is, thanks for watching, and take care, everybody.